Welcome to Enchanted Astrology with Ariel Smith. Thank you so much for joining me today as we explore the astrology for the week of June 17th to June 23rd. Now, this week brings several significant shifts because we have Venus in Leo opposing Pluto in Aquarius, and that Venus is supported by Neptune and Uranus. We have Chiron entering into Taurus for the first time in decades. And on June 21st, the Sun enters Cancer, marking the summer solstice and the beginning of summer here in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, at first glance, these may seem like completely separate events. But when I sat with them, I noticed that they were all pointing toward the same underlying theme. So this week is asking us to examine our relationship with attachment. So what are we holding on to? What do we believe we need in order to be happy, safe, worthy, or fulfilled? And perhaps more importantly, are we responding to reality as it is? Or are we responding to a perception that is no longer true? Because sometimes the greatest transformations don't happen when our circumstances change. They happen when we see those circumstances differently. And this feels very much like the energy that we are stepping into. Now, we begin the week with Venus in Leo opposing Pluto in Aquarius. Venus represents what we value, what we love, what we are drawn toward. And in Leo, Venus is unapologetic about her desires. She knows what brings her joy. She knows what resonates with her heart, and she wants to express herself fully and authentically. Leo is not an energy that hides. It is visible, expressive, and courageous. And at its highest expression, Venus in Leo teaches us to honor our hearts. But at its lower expression, Venus in Leo can become attached to validation. It can become attached to being seen, understood, agreed with, or appreciated by others. So it can fall into the belief that if something truly matters to me, everyone else should be able to see its value too. And this is where Pluto in Aquarius enters the conversation, because Aquarius reminds us that love and freedom are inseparable. Not freedom from commitment, not freedom from caring, but freedom from attachment. Because attachment and love are not the same thing. Love says, I choose this. Attachment says, I need this. Love says, I honor your path. Attachment says, you must walk the path that I have chosen. So this is the deeper teaching of Aquarius. It is not emotional distance. Okay? It is not indifference. It is not withdrawing from life. It is honoring the sovereignty of every single soul, and that includes your own. And so Pluto asks a very powerful question this week. He's asking, can you know what you want without needing it? Can you move wholeheartedly towards what excites you while remaining free from the outcome? Can you pursue your desires without attaching your worth, your identity, or your happiness to whether they materialize exactly as imagined? Because many of us have been taught that happiness exists somewhere outside of us. It is in the perfect relationship, or the perfect career, the perfect amount of money, basically the perfect outcome. And so we spend our lives trying to secure happiness through controlling circumstances. But Pluto in Aquarius is revealing that this pursuit often creates the very suffering that we are trying to escape. The tighter that we hold, the more fear we create. The more our identity becomes attached to the outcomes, the more fragile our peace becomes. And yet, when we reconnect with who we truly are, there's something remarkable that happens, because we discover that our worth was never dependent on the outcome in the first place. And we can still have desires. We can still have preferences. Absolutely. We can still move even passionately toward what brings us joy, but we do so from freedom rather than fear. And it's not because we need the experience to complete us. It's because we are already whole enough to just enjoy it. And this theme becomes even stronger because Venus is also receiving support from Neptune in Aries during this opposition to Pluto. And this is where Neptune and Aries become such an important part of the story. Because if Pluto is asking us to release attachment, Neptune is helping us understand how to do that. So many of us have been taught to measure our worth through external things, right? Through our accomplishments, our income, our possessions, our appearance. I mean, the list goes on. What other people think of us, how productive we are, how successful we appear to be. And for most of our lives, this has been the framework we were given for understanding what our value is. And if our worth is tied to these external outcomes, then of course we become attached to them. Of course we fear losing them. And of course we feel anxious when things don't go according to plan. Because if our identity is built upon these things, then every setback starts to feel very personal. Every rejection feels like a statement somehow about who we are. Every disappointment feels like we're losing our value. But Neptune in Aries is helping us to dissolve that illusion. So Neptune reminds us that who we are is far greater than any role that we play, any title that we hold, or any achievement that we may accumulate. And Aries is asking us to discover that truth directly for ourselves. Aries is a very personal sign. So this is not through someone else's philosophy. This is not through a belief system. This is through your own personal experience. This is a process of remembering who we truly are and remembering that our worth is inherent. Our value is not something that we earn, and it's remembering that what we truly are cannot be increased by success or diminished by failure. And when that realization begins to take root, something very deep within us starts to shift. The need to prove ourselves, to control outcomes, or the need for constant validation, these all start to soften. Because we stop looking outside of ourselves for something that really can only be found within. And this actually allows us, oddly enough, to enjoy life so much more deeply. Because attachment has a sneaky way of draining the joy from the very things that we love. When we believe we need something in order to be happy, it actually becomes very heavy. It becomes stressful, and it becomes something that we are afraid of losing. But when we are free to just enjoy something without needing it to define us, the whole experience becomes so much lighter. It becomes more joyful and more authentic. And this is the gift that Neptune is offering Venus. It's a reminder that love does not require possession. Worth does not require achievement, and joy actually does not require guarantees. So, at the same time as this supportive aspect is playing out, we also have Uranus in a sextile to Venus, adding yet another beautiful layer to this story. Because one of the most fascinating things about attachment is that it can really narrow our vision, right? Because when we become attached to a specific outcome, we stop seeing all the other possibilities that are available to us. We become very convinced that there is only one path forward, only one solution, one opportunity, only one way for things to work out. But the truth is that life is rarely that limited. And Uranus loves to remind us of this. Now, Uranus is the planet of surprises, breakthroughs, sudden opportunities, and unexpected possibilities. So Uranus shows up in a way that you never could plan for. It's something you weren't even looking for. It completely exists outside the limits of our expectations. And sometimes the very thing that we were trying so hard to make happen doesn't actually unfold because something even more aligned is trying to enter our lives. But we can only recognize it if we're willing to let go of our attachment to how we think things are supposed to happen. And this is why freedom is such an important theme this week, because freedom doesn't mean giving up on your dreams. It doesn't mean just becoming completely passive and pretending that you don't even care. No, it means caring deeply while being able to remain open. It means moving toward what brings you joy, but doing that without demanding that life follow your script. It means trusting that there may be possibilities available that your current perspective just can't see. And with Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus all engaging Venus at the same time, this feels like a profound invitation. An invitation to choose love over attachment, which means choosing trust over control, and freedom over fear, and to move toward what calls to your heart while allowing life enough space to surprise you. And as beautiful as that message is, what is happening only a couple days after this transit reveals why this lesson is starting to become so important, because 2 days later, Chiron enters into Taurus on June 19th. Now, Chiron will only remain in Taurus until September before briefly returning back to Aries. But this first entrance is going to give us a glimpse of the healing journey that will unfold over the coming years. So, after a week that is asking us to examine attachment, freedom, worth, identity, Chiron moves into the sign that governs many of the things that we become attached to. Taurus is our relationship with the material world. It is how we sustain ourselves. It is food, shelter, money, possessions, resources, the body, and even the earth itself. So it is what basically helps us feel safe and secure. And when Chiron enters Taurus, one of the deepest wounds available for healing is our relationship with security. And more specifically, the belief that we are separate from life and therefore must struggle against it. So many of us have inherited this worldview that is built upon scarcity. And this is the belief that there is not enough resources, not enough opportunities, not enough love, not enough support, and not enough security. And from that perception, life becomes this big competition, a constant effort basically to acquire, protect, defend, and survive. But what if that perception is not actually the truth? Because when we look closely at nature, what we find is actually not this endless race of competition. What we find actually is relationship and cooperation. Now, there are pockets where competition exists. Nature does contain challenge, adaptation, and survival, but competition is just one very small part. Because again and again, when we look at nature, we see cooperation and connection. So the trees in a forest are not trying to compete with one another for sunlight and water. We found, right, that through these vast underground mycelium networks, they actually share nutrients, they exchange information, and they even support younger or struggling trees. So a healthy forest actually functions like a community. And bees and flowers are another great example when we look at nature, because the bees gather nourishment through the pollen in the flower, and the flower there then becomes pollinated, and both are mutually benefiting from this relationship. It's not one at the expense of the other. And even our own bodies highly depend upon cooperation, because we don't typically think of ourselves like this, but we actually have trillions of microorganisms living within us. And these trillions of microorganisms support our digestion, our immunity, and all kinds of biological processes that we could never survive without. And even some of the examples that we've been taught to view as competition, when we look closer, we discover that they're actually contributing to a great balance. So when we look at something even like predators and prey, we've been somewhat conditioned to see this relationship as evidence that life is basically just fundamentally brutal, right? But yet, predators play their own essential role in maintaining the health of the entire ecosystem. I mean, we can look at back when wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone, their presence helped to restore balance throughout the entire environment. So deer populations changed their behavior, and vegetation was able to recover, river systems stabilized, and countless other species benefited. So one expression of life supported many, many others simply by being what it naturally was. And perhaps that is one of the deepest teachings of Chiron in Taurus, is that you do not contribute to the whole by becoming something you are not. You contribute to the whole by becoming more fully yourself. And this is not the self built on fear. It's not the self built on defense mechanisms or survival strategies. It's the self that exists underneath all of those things. Because when we are disconnected from our true nature, we often assume that our value must be earned. We must prove our worth. We assume that being significant depends on some type of external achievement or accomplishment. But nature doesn't operate that way. A bee does not need to justify its existence. A tree does not need to prove its value, right? A river does not need to ask somebody permission for it to do its thing. So each fulfills its role simply just by expressing its true nature. And the same is true for us. So one of the greatest wounds Chiron may help reveal in Taurus is how often we have underestimated our own place within the larger web of life. It is so easy to fall into the belief that we are small, insignificant, little people. We are just one person. But this perception often comes from being unable to see just how deeply connected we all truly are. And if you just imagine for a moment that you could see every single relationship your life touches, every person you've encouraged, every conversation that's changed someone's day, every decision that has had a ripple effect outward in ways you can't even fathom, every connection that extends beyond your awareness, you would see that your existence reaches so much further than you can possibly realize. A single bee may be the bee that pollinates the flower that becomes the plum on your fruit tree. The bee is not trying to change the world. It's not trying to give you a plum. It is simply just following its nature. But the impact of that simple act ripples out far beyond what that bee could ever see. That plum that you eat, if you discard the seed, could be a brand new plum tree, all because of that bee acting in its nature. And perhaps the same is true for us. Perhaps our value has never been determined by what we possess, achieve, or accumulate. Perhaps our value is actually just inherent in our participation within life itself. And if that is true, then so much of what we have been taught to chase begins to lose its hold on us. Because no external achievement can add to what we already are. And no external loss can take it away either. And this feels very much like the healing Chiron is beginning to open. A healing around scarcity, around worth, a healing around our relationship with the material world. And most importantly, a healing around the belief that we are separate from the very life that sustains and surrounds us. So over these next few months, as Chiron begins this journey through Taurus, pay attention to where Taurus falls in your chart by house, because that house may offer clues as to where these themes are beginning to emerge and play out for you personally. Because as we approach the summer solstice, we see these same themes appearing once again, but this time through a different lens. So on June 21st at 2:25 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, the sun enters into the sign of Cancer and marks the summer solstice. Now, this is the moment when the sun reaches its highest point in the sky, at least in the northern hemisphere, bringing us the longest day of the year and ushering in the official beginning of summer. Now, the solstice is always a powerful turning point because it marks a shift in light. And because so much of this week's astrology is centered around themes of perception, awareness, and seeing ourselves more clearly, that symbolism feels very meaningful. So when I pulled the solstice charts, I pulled a couple charts for the location where I am in Alberta, which is Mountain Standard Time, as well as the national chart for Canada and the US as they operate on the same time zone. One detail immediately caught my attention with both of the charts because for the chart set for the Mountain time zone, Chiron sits directly on the ascendant at 0 degrees of Taurus. And for the chart set for our national capital, we have Ceres rising in Gemini. Ceres conjunct the ascendant in Gemini. Now, at first glance, these may seem a bit unrelated, but both Taurus and Ceres are deeply connected to our relationship with the physical world. So Taurus governs how we sustain ourselves through the material reality. It relates to food, shelter, money, resources, comfort, security, and the body itself. And Ceres governs nourishment, caregiving, receiving support, food, harvests, and our relationship with attachment and loss. Now, in mythology, Ceres, known as Demeter in Greek mythology, experienced profound grief when her daughter Persephone descended into the underworld. So the earth itself reflected this grief falling into winter during her absence. So both Taurus and Ceres are concerned with many of the same questions. What do I need to feel safe? What sustains me? How do I care for myself? What am I attached to? And what happens when I lose something I believed I needed? Now, these themes feel very important right now because humanity is going through a profound shift in how we answer those questions. So for much of our history, we have experienced ourselves primarily as physical beings trying to survive in this material world. And from that perspective, security becomes everything. Safety becomes everything, and it centers around acquiring resources. The physical world becomes the center of our identity. But something is changing, and more people are beginning to recognize themselves as something much greater than the physical body. Many beings are beginning to discover that we are not merely physical beings who occasionally have spiritual experiences. We are actually spiritual beings expressing ourselves through a physical experience. And when that perception shifts, our relationship to the material world changes as well. So the body and earth still remain important. They're very important parts of this physical expression. Food, shelter, resources, relationships, these all remain important, but they are no longer carrying the impossible burden of defining our worth. They are no longer responsible for telling us who we are. So instead, they become expressions of life rather than the source of life itself. And this feels like a much deeper invitation of Chiron in Taurus, which is to heal our relationship with the physical world by seeing it more truly for what it actually is. Because often, what actually creates suffering isn't reality itself, it's the way that we perceive reality. And this is where the Virgo moon, which were in both solstice charts, becomes very interesting as well, because Virgo is deeply connected to discernment, to observation, to seeing what is actually there rather than what we assume is there. And sometimes a very small shift in perception changes everything. So imagine waking in the middle of the night and seeing what appears to be a person standing silently in the corner of your room. Oh my gosh, immediately your body reacts, your heart races, your muscles tense, your mind begins preparing for danger. You start imagining what could happen next. You make decisions from fear because the situation appears very threatening, right? But then you turn on the light and you discover, oh, it wasn't a person at all. It's actually just a coat hanging on a chair. And the moment, the instant that you see that clearly, everything changes. The fear disappears, the anxiety disappears, the need to defend yourself disappears, and nothing in reality changed. Right? Reality was always the same. What changed was your perception. And this feels like the journey that we are collectively moving through right now. Because for a very long time, many of us have identified almost entirely with the small, separate self. And that small, separate self must compete, prove itself. It must acquire enough, accomplish enough, and secure enough in order to feel safe. And from that perception, fear makes total sense. Attachment makes sense. Scarcity makes sense. But what if the perception was never the actual truth, just like the shadow of the person was never the actual truth? What if the separate self is just like that shadow, an expression of something far greater? What if much of the fear that we carry comes primarily from forgetting who we are? Because when we start reconnecting with our deeper nature, it's just like turning on the light. We start to see ourselves differently, we start to see others differently, and we start to see life differently. And all of a sudden, in that instant, things that once felt very threatening to us start to lose some of their power because we are no longer viewing it through the same lens. And this feels like medicine that will be coming in the months ahead. So it's a new relationship with the material world, a new relationship with worth, a new relationship with security, and most importantly, a new relationship with ourselves. One that is rooted less in fear and more in truth, less in survival and more in love, less in competition, more in cooperation. Because when the light comes on, it becomes very difficult to continue fearing that coat in the corner, because you now see it for what it is. And I believe many people are beginning to turn on that light. And in many ways, that brings us right back full circle to where we began, where this week's astrology, it's not asking us to stop wanting things. It's not asking us to stop dreaming, creating, loving, or moving toward what brings us joy. Rather, it's asking us to examine the energy from which we pursue those things. So, are we moving toward them from love or from fear? Are we moving from a place of freedom or from a place of attachment? Are we pursuing something because it genuinely resonates with our heart, or because we believe we need it in order to be worthy, complete, or fulfilled? So Venus in Leo reminds us to honor what we love. Pluto in Aquarius reminds us to not lose ourselves within it. Neptune reminds us that our worth cannot be measured by external circumstances. Uranus reminds us that life often has possibilities available that we cannot see. Chiron reminds us that many of our deepest attachments are rooted in old wounds around survival, scarcity, and separation. And the solstice reminds us that sometimes the greatest transformation happens not when life changes, but when our perception changes. When we can see more clearly, we start to move differently. And then when we move differently, we create different experiences, and those different experiences create new realities. So as you move through this week, notice where you are being invited into greater freedom. Notice where you are attaching your worth to an outcome. Notice where life may be asking you to trust just a little more deeply. And notice what becomes available when you start to loosen your grip and allow yourself to move toward joy without demanding a particular results. Because there is a beautiful difference between saying, I need this in order to be happy, and saying, this brings me joy and I choose to move toward it. One comes from fear and the other comes from love. And that distinction feels like one of the most important teachings that is available to us right now. So this week's Yin Yoga class is centered around the Venus-Pluto opposition and this very theme of moving toward what lights up your heart while releasing attachments to the outcome. So learning how to hold a desire with openness rather than with control. To follow joy without making your happiness dependent upon it. So if you would like to explore this energy more deeply through practice, you can join through the yoga studio at enchantedAstrology.ca. And as always, thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I am continually grateful for each and every one who listens, reflects, and walks this journey alongside of me. I wish you a beautiful summer solstice, a joyful beginning to Cancer season, and a week filled with insight, freedom, and love. Take care, and I will be back next Wednesday with another episode.